let's get right down to the business for this weekend, where we're going to continue on in our theme, playing off of the reform movements that came about because of the Second Great Awakening. And specifically today, the major reform is going to all have one central theme, and that's going to be striving for a utopian society. That word utopian may be a word some of you are familiar with, but if not, utopian means essentially the perfect society, the perfect life. Utopian is just a fancy word for perfect, or consummate, or quintessential, any of those words you want to throw in there. The Second Great Awakening, as we talked about, inspired people to look within society for ways to improve society. And whether it be abolition, whether it be women's rights, whether it be temperance or prison reforms, people were looking for a way to improve society. And these utopian societies all share that in common. And so yet it's another theme playing off the Second Great Awakening. And I'm going to give you a couple of rapid fire examples. That's the whole purpose of tonight's video. And what I'm going to tell you we're going to do on Monday is we're actually going to be heading outside. Yes, you heard that right. We're going to be going outside for a really fun outdoor lesson. It's one of my favorite lessons of the year, where you're actually going to read some of these examples that I refer to on the video tonight. So let's get down to a couple of the utopian societies. And the first one I want to start off with is arguably the most important one of the entire group. And these are going to be the Transcendentalists. The Transcendentalists. The Transcendentalists were groups of writers, people who were elitely educated, higher educated people within New England. This was a movement that started up in New England. And the Transcendentalists were groups of writers who meshed their literary prowess, their ability to write, with two things. So you take good writing, good education, and you mix that with, number one, religion. The Transcendentalists were heavily inspired by Christianity, especially Protestantism, as we learned about last week. And you mix religion with nature. The Transcendentalists will always be known for writing prolifically about nature and religion. And really, the Transcendentalist movement is one of the most important literary movements in all of America in the 19th century. In fact, around this time period, 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, this is the beginning of a lot of American literary genres, and I'm going to be exposing you to some of that on Monday. So American literature is now starting to sort of develop on its own, and that's where we see some great authors like Hawthorne and Poe, some of the more famous American authors that you guys will be reading perhaps this year in 8th grade as well. And the Transcendentalists fit into this theme of using literature to promote sort of the sense of what it means to be American. And that's really like what the Transcendentalists focused heavily on. They looked at their position in the world as Americans, and they tied in religion and they tied in nature and wrote about these themes prolifically throughout their works. Some of the most famous Transcendentalists we'll be taking a look at, and they include people like Henry David Thoreau, who was arguably like the central Transcendentalist, and we'll be looking at passages by Thoreau. The other main Transcendentalist we'll talk about is Ralph Waldo Emerson. He was another leader of the Transcendentalist movement. But a really important Transcendentalist that I also like to include, and we're going to read her works, and this kind of plays into the idea that women were starting to have more of a voice in the early 19th century, and that's Margaret Fuller. So you've got Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Margaret Fuller, three key Transcendentalists for you to be aware of. And the Transcendentalist movement, it strove for this greatness within society. It strove for people to find a balance with nature and with religion. And so those themes really meshed very well together, along with this sort of new identity of American literature. Now, another artistic movement to go along with the Transcendentalist movement, think of this movement as almost Transcendentalism with a paintbrush. And that's going to be the Hudson River School movement. The Hudson River, of course, the great river that snakes its way up the Atlantic coast, up into the upstate New York and into eventually Canada, parts of Canada. The Hudson River school movement was an artistic movement of painters who, much like the Transcendentalists, the Hudson River School painters depicted themes of nature within their works. And we'll take a look at an example of one of those, and you'll get to evaluate that, along with the other Transcendentalist works on Monday when we do our outdoor classroom. So think of the Transcendentalists and the Hudson River School painters. One was a literary movement, that's Transcendentalism, and then the Hudson River School was an artistic movement. And really, again, these two themes were striving for greatness, trying to find that perfect balance between nature and religion within society. So those are two of the utopian sort of movements I want to get into. The others that we're going to talk about definitely focus a lot more heavily on religion. And they were really religious movements that sprung up, some of them from Protestant denominations that we've talked about, like Quakers. And the first one I'm going to talk about were a very strict group of Quakers who were known as Shakers. Quakers to Shakers. And the Shakers, interestingly, I actually grew up right down the road. In fact, my public high school in my hometown was called Shaker High School. And that's because the founder of the Shakers, a woman named Ann Lee, formed this group of religious Quakers in upstate New York. And the Quakers had a pretty good run throughout most of the 19th century. And what their religion was all about, they strove for this perfect utopian society using religion. And they're probably most famous for two things. Number one, they made really intricate, well-crafted furniture. In fact, you can still buy Shaker furniture. It's still a style of furniture that you can buy. And they were very well known for producing furniture. The other thing that the Shakers were known for is kind of a goofy thing, but their religious ceremonies were based upon intense dancing, hence the name Shaker. That's actually where the name came from. And I'm going to play for you a clip because every time I see this, it makes me think of what the Shakers probably looked like when they were dancing. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the artist, the musician named Lorde, but she's kind of well known for dancing quite intensely and gyrating all over stage. So here's a clip of Lorde, and I want you to think about how this was a part of the Shaker religious practices. So here's the clip of Lorde. So anyways, every year I play that for the APUSH kids. They find that absolutely hilarious. But in truth, the Shakers, eventually they were phased out. Their order, their religious utopian society sort of phased out. And that's mainly because the Shakers did not believe in procreation. That's a very polite way of putting that they did not allow for a man and woman to come together. And therefore, the Shakers, as you can imagine, there really wasn't like a longevity there possible with their society. So their practice of abstinence sort of left the Shakers to a very short but important impact as an example of utopian societies that were emerging in the United States. One last group that I'm going to mention, and we here in Arizona have a lot of familiarity with this group of utopian sort of religious group because there's a large base of these 1840s, this religious group that sprung up in the 1830s and 1840s, and that would be the Mormons. Mormonism, and I'm not going to go into the heavy details of Mormonism, but Mormonism was a movement, a religious movement that started in the 1830s, 1840s by a man named Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith was the founder of the Mormon movement. And Mormonism actually originated once again from upstate New York. The fact that so many of these movements started in New York should not come as a surprise. After all, that was the hot spot, the burned over district during the Second Great Awakening. So Mormonism as a utopian society, Mormons, and again, I'm not going to go into their belief system. Rather, what I'm going to talk about is the importance of their movements within America, because Mormons did have some controversial beliefs, and as a result of their controversial beliefs, they were forced to move and migrate out of New York, and they consistently sort of looked to settle in different states and different territories. And the struggle for Mormons to find acceptance within different territories ultimately took them from New York to the Midwest, where in Illinois, the founder of Mormonism, Joseph Smith, was actually killed in jail. He was beaten and killed in jail. And eventually, though, his followers, the people that were loyal Mormons, they took their movement all the way out into the far west territory, into modern-day Utah and that region. And what this is known as, the movement of Mormons, is known as what the Mormon Trek, Trek, the Mormon Trek. And the Mormon Trek is really significant in U.S. history for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's one of these utopian, Christian societies that's coming up in the 1830s and 40s. That's number one. Two, the movement of Mormons obviously led to all sorts of trade, cultural diffusion into the Great Plains region of Utah, but also it really stands as an example of a group that had controversial views. Their religious practices were unique. Much like the Shakers who had their dancing, the Mormons had some very specific beliefs that were quite different than typical Christian beliefs. And so therefore, as a result of their controversial beliefs, the Mormons were constantly forced to move and to find a place where they could settle. And when they chose Utah as a place to settle, the Mormons did run into some conflicts with not only Native Americans that lived in the region, but also eventually Mormons came into direct contact with the United States government. And Mormons had to essentially struggle to sustain their beliefs. And what's impressive about the Mormon Trek, and ultimately the importance of Mormons in American history, here's a utopian sort of group struggling to keep its beliefs alive, exercising their constitutional amendment rights of free speech and free religion and free expression. And despite the fact that Mormons came out of this era where many groups were trying, like the Shakers, many groups were trying to create a utopian society, Mormons ultimately are here to stay. And as I mentioned, the importance of Mormonism in Arizona. Arizona is one of the largest states outside of Utah of Mormon influence in the entire country. And Mormonism now has spread all over the world as a form of Christian beliefs. Granted, it's different than Protestantism, and it's a little different than it's quite different than Catholicism as well. But Mormonism is here to stay, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. So here's a direct tie back to the 1830s, 1840s antebellum period in the United States, where Mormonism, in a quest to create its sort of the own utopian society, is a long-lasting religious practice here in the United States, still to this day. So a quick recap. I talked about Transcendentalism as a form of utopian literature. And then I talked about the Hudson River School as a form of utopian art. The key was they blended Christian and nature, as well as creating this new sense of American art forms. And we'll be looking at those on Monday. And then I talked about two utopian religious groups, the Shakers and as well as the Mormons. And so I'm keeping it very compact, very brief. I got some good things planned in the next couple of days before the break. We got that big team trivia competition coming up on Wednesday, so I'm sure you guys are geared up for that. Let's finish the week strong, and as we head into break, I wish everyone a great rest of your weekend. As always, the past shapes the future. Take care, everybody.